Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack one of the most incredibly complex, multi-layered geopolitical tensions on the entire planet, the border conflict between India and China. I mean, if you just glance at the news today, you see troops stationed at these freezing, high altitudes, intense diplomatic standoffs, and this constant buzzing hum of tension between two nuclear-armed Asian giants. And let's be clear, this isn't just some distant territorial dispute. The fallout here literally impacts global trade, technology, and international security for all of us. But to truly understand what's happening right now on the ground, we can't just look at the present. We have to dig into the fascinating source material we've gathered to see exactly how history, modern alliances, and some incredibly fierce regional competition all collide. So before we really get into the weeds, let's quickly pin down a concept you've probably heard before: divide and rule. It is absolutely central to understanding both the historical origins of this conflict and the modern accusations surrounding it. Essentially, divide and rule is a classic, age-old strategy of gaining and maintaining power by breaking up larger concentrations of power into smaller, weaker pieces. As we analyze the sources today, we're going to see this exact concept pop up twice. First, as a deliberate tool used by the British Empire in the past, and second, as a pretty heavy accusation thrown at Western powers today. To make sense of this massive geopolitical web, we're going to break this explainer down into 5 quick sections: the legacy of colonial borders, the Western alliance factor, Russia's specific divide and rule claims, the competing national perspectives, and finally, what's driving this beyond the colonial past. All right, part 1, the legacy of colonial borders. You know, when you talk to historians and geopolitical analysts, they almost all agree that the foundations of this territorial dispute were quite literally manufactured by the British Empire. And we're not just talking about sloppy map-making here. This was standard British colonial practice during the Great Game rivalry with the Russian Empire. The British relied on strategic ambiguity. They intentionally left borders vaguely defined to secure their own imperial interests. Take a look at this timeline. In 1865, the Johnson Line is proposed, which basically places the Aksai Chin region under British influence. But here's the kicker: they never actually officially presented this to the Chinese government. Then, flash forward to 1914, and we get the McMahon Line. Britain negotiated this boundary completely in secret with Tibetan representatives, without getting the full consent of the Chinese central government. So, unsurprisingly, China has historically rejected it as an illegal imperialist imposition. The direct result of all this deliberate colonial ambiguity: a vast, incredibly tense, undefined buffer zone that remains disputed to this very day, known as the Line of Actual Control, or the LAC. Moving right along to Section 2, the Western Alliance Factor. So colonial borders obviously set the stage over a century ago, right? But modern global alignments have added an entirely new, highly volatile layer of complexity to the region. The absolutely crucial point here is how Western alliances are actively influencing the current relationship between these two countries. Many political scientists look at the board and argue that the United States, along with its Western allies, clearly views India as a vital democratic counterweight to China's massive asymmetric rise in Asia. And this isn't just theory. We're seeing it happen in real time. There is a significant, visible deepening of military and technological ties between the West and New Delhi. You see this most clearly channeled through the whole Indo-Pacific strategy and frameworks like the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which you probably know as the Quad. Critics observe this dynamic and ask a really tough question. Is this a genuine security partnership for the region, or is it a modern mechanism designed to keep two massive Asian powers divided? Which perfectly sets up Section 3, Russia's divide and rule claim. Now, this is where things get really explosive regarding those Western alliances, specifically when we look at the perspective coming out of Moscow. Just listen to the exact words of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov here, and keep in mind he's closely echoing sentiments directly from President Putin. Lavrov explicitly claims that the very term Indo-Pacific region was engineered by the West purely to give its policy a clear anti-Chinese direction. He argues that the ultimate goal is literally to pit India and China against each other. It's a forceful, heavy accusation. He's basically saying the US and its allies are dusting off the old British imperial playbook and reviving classic divide and rule tactics just to maintain Western hegemony in Asia. Okay, Section 4. Competing national perspectives. Of course, to stay impartial and really understand the reality on the ground, we have to examine how the two nations actually at the heart of this conflict view all these historical and modern accusations. And as you can see, there is a stark contrast in how Beijing and New Delhi interpret the situation. The Chinese perspective, which you'll see heavily featured in their state media, actually aligns somewhat with that Russian view we just looked at. Beijing frequently accuses Western powers, specifically the US, of actively instigating these tensions. They argue Washington is just exploiting those old historical border anxieties to draw New Delhi into an anti-China containment alliance. On the flip side, the Indian perspective is entirely different. While Indian policymakers fully acknowledge that the colonial cartography left by the British was an absolute mess, they do not blame Western manipulation for today's border clashes. Instead, they firmly point the finger at modern Chinese territorial expansionism, active border transgressions, and Beijing's ongoing refusal to sit down and clarify where that line of actual control actually is. And finally, Section 5, Beyond the Colonial Past. Because honestly, just blaming Western imperialism, whether you're talking about historical British map-making or modern US strategies, it kind of oversimplifies a vastly complex relationship. We absolutely have to look at the very real, non-colonial factors driving this rivalry on the ground today. First up on this table, we have the asymmetric rise. China's rapid economic and military expansion has created a massive power imbalance, and that causes deep, understandable security concerns in New Delhi. Second is the Pakistan factor. China's deep strategic and military alliance with Pakistan, especially things like the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is seen as a direct threat to India's security architecture. Third, regional influence. Look, this isn't just about a snowy Himalayan border. Both of these nations are fiercely competing for economic and political dominance over smaller neighbors like Sri Lanka, Nepal, the Maldives, and Bangladesh. And finally, nationalism. There are incredibly strong nationalist sentiments in both domestic populations right now, which means that any sort of political compromise on territorial sovereignty is practically impossible for leaders in either capital to sell to their people. So we've unpacked a ton of complex source material in this explainer today. We've seen exactly how the deliberate, sneaky manipulations of British border drawing laid down a foundation of conflict. We've examined how modern Western alliances, like the Quad, are shifting the strategic balance, and we've heard Russia's explosive claims that this is all just a modern divide-and-rule strategy. But we've also looked at the undeniable regional realities, from the Pakistan factor to fierce economic competition that are clearly driving the tension from within. All of this leaves us with one vital final question to consider. Are India and China ultimately trapped by the legacy of colonial history, or are their own modern geopolitical ambitions driving the ultimate divide? Think on that for a bit, and we'll catch you in the next explainer.